Who was Charles Darwin really? Welcome to Galápagos, where history comes alive and every video immerses you in the destiny of those who have shaped the world. Today, let's trace the path of a man whose name has changed our view of the world for more than a century and a half, Charles Darwin, the visionary naturalist, the author of The Origin of Species, this foundational text that shook the certainties of his time and redefined man's place in the universe. But behind this scientific revolution, one question remains. Who was Darwin really? A solitary genius, crafting in the silence of his observations the theory that would change history? Or an heir of shared ideas, a researcher buoyed by the discoveries of his contemporaries, who was merely the clearest voice of a century in upheaval? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and bon voyage. Around 1800, the world stood at a complex crossroads of political, economic, and intellectual dynamics. The upheavals caused by the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars had redrawn the map of Europe and, more broadly, sparked new ambitions on a global scale. The Congress of Vienna, held between 1814 and 1815, marked the official end of the Napoleonic conflicts and sought to restore balance between the great powers. The negotiations, led by Austria, Prussia, Russia, and the United Kingdom, redefined borders, rebuilt alliances, and restored some deposed monarchs in the hope of preventing the renewal of revolutionary waves that had shaken the continent. For today's international audience, it is essential to understand that this Congress was not just a diplomatic conference. It inaugurated an era of mutual surveillance between sovereigns, who intended to maintain stability through cooperation as much as through threat. Meanwhile, Britain, victorious in the Napoleonic Wars, began consolidating its maritime empire. From its supremacy on the seas to the rise of its colonies, it sought to dominate world trade. In the Atlantic, commercial and naval rivalries with France and Spain continued even after official peace. The fights for control of sea routes, plantations, and markets remained fierce. The Royal Navy, strong in British navigation tradition, also undertook numerous scientific expeditions to map coasts and explore little-known territories. This mix of imperial ambitions, thirst for discoveries, and competitive spirit fueled in the early 19th century a genuine planetary curiosity where the advancement of knowledge and territorial expansion intertwined. At the same time, the First Industrial Revolution was radically transforming European societies, with repercussions on other continents as well. It was based on the intensive exploitation of coal, the development of steam engines, and the increased use of iron. In England, the invention of the spinning machine and mechanical looms boosted textile production, while the use of steam in mines and transportation opened up new perspectives. Road and river networks, then railways in subsequent decades, promoted the mobility of people and goods. Postal communications also improved. The exchange of newspapers, gazettes, and scholarly journals spread throughout Europe and even beyond. Scholars could follow scientific novelties, publish their discoveries, and spark intellectual controversies on a large scale. Soon, the press would play a decisive role in shaping public opinion, spreading liberal ideas, and fostering the emergence of national movements. The expansion of scientific travel became a significant phenomenon during this period. The hydrographic navies of the great powers, particularly those of Great Britain, France, and Spain, were developing distant exploration campaigns. Aboard these ships, naturalists, botanists, and cartographers embarked to gather information and describe remote regions. The cabinets of curiosities, which had flourished in the modern era, were gradually transforming into public museums, notably in London and Paris. These institutions made it possible to display specimens, geological samples, and ethnographic objects brought back from the expeditions. Significant progress in the field of measurement standardization accompanied these ventures. There was a focus on accurately determining latitude, longitude, and altitude during geographical surveys, while early thermometers, barometers, and improved chronometers helped to collect more reliable data. In this way, European nations demonstrated their desire to establish a universal knowledge base while reinforcing their control over distant territories. On the scientific front, several debates inherited from the Ancien Regime remained relevant in the 1800s-1830s. The notion of the chain of beings, defended by some 18th century scholars, postulated a continuous hierarchy among different organisms, from so-called lower creatures to humans. It was often part of a providential view of the world, where the fixity of species and divine organization were considered an immutable whole. Finalism proposed seeing nature as the manifestation of a superior design, coordinating each being in a precise order. These ideas, supported by a majority of religious thinkers, continued to influence conceptions of nature at a time when new theories were emerging. Geology, in particular, was experiencing a conceptual revolution. Until then, under the influence of French naturalist Georges Cuvier, it was believed that brutal catastrophes had shaped the Earth and caused the extinction of many species at different times. This catastrophism, supported by fossil discoveries in successive geological strata, appeared consistent with a literal reading of Genesis. However, scholars like James Hutton, followed by Charles Lyell, proposed a more uniform vision known as uniformitarianism, asserting that the geological processes observable today had always occurred at the same scale, but over extremely long periods. This divergence of views emerged even as calculations and estimates, based on observations from astronomy and chemistry, suggested that the Earth was much older than the general biblical chronology claimed. The scholarly circles thus began to openly debate the actual age of the planet, paving the way for future theories of biological evolution. Outside Europe, the world was also experiencing profound upheavals. In Latin America, the wars of independence led to the dismantling of much of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and other local leaders mobilized armies of patriots to expel colonial authorities and establish new sovereign states. These independences marked a turning point. They reshaped geopolitical balances and disrupted commercial exchanges. Simultaneously, in the Caribbean and the South Atlantic, the slave trade, heavily criticized, was under increasing pressure from Great Britain, which officially abolished the trade in 1807 and encouraged other nations to do the same. However, slavery remained prevalent in some territories, even though the United Kingdom abolished it in 1833 in most of its possessions. These reforms faced local resistance for both economic and cultural reasons. The era was thus marked by an antagonism between principles of liberty inherited from the revolutionary period and the reality of vast systems of human exploitation. The period preceding Charles Darwin's work is teeming with ideas and research that lay the groundwork for the theory of evolution. From the mid-18th century, naturalists strived to better understand, classify, and compare the diversity of living organisms. At that time, one of the pillars of natural science is the Linnaean classification system, established by the Swedish scholar Carl von Linné. With binomial nomenclature, Linné proposes a genus name and a species name for each creature, paving the way for an ordered and internationally comprehensible method of description. This innovation greatly facilitates the connection of discoveries from various horizons. During the second half of the 18th century, thinkers like Georges-Louis Leclerc de Buffon emphasized the variability of living beings. In his immense natural history, published starting in 1749, Buffon proposes the idea that species might share common ancestors and change under the influence of the environment, even though he remains attached to certain fixist conceptions. In parallel, Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles, publishes poems and speculative treatises suggesting that life might evolve in successive stages. Later, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck develops the notion of transformism, based on the use or non-use of certain organs. According to him, these modifications are transmitted to offspring, explaining the gradual emergence of new forms. The publication in 1798 of the Essay on the Principle of Population by Thomas Robert Malthus introduces a demographic perspective into debates about nature. Malthus argues that the human population tends to grow more rapidly than food resources, inevitably causing a form of competition for subsistence. This idea, described under the term struggle for existence, goes beyond the strictly human framework when adopted by some naturalists. By imagining organisms competing for limited resources, it suggests that advantageous variations could increase chances of survival and reproduction. Even though Malthus is not directly interested in biological evolution, his concept feeds future reflections on selection. Another central figure of this era is Alexander von Humboldt, whose travels in South America, undertaken between 1799 and 1804, are marked by a global approach to nature. Accompanied by botanist Aimé Bonpland, Humboldt observes not only plant and animal species, but also the climate, geology, and geographical distribution of organisms. He introduces the notion of isotherms, lines connecting points of equal average temperature, and describes how flora changes with altitude, prefiguring modern ecology. His accounts, such as the journey to the equinoctial regions of the new continent, generate great enthusiasm in Europe and encourage an integrated view of the study of life, focusing on interactions between the environment and organisms. In the English-speaking world, the late 18th and early 19th centuries see the establishment of important scholarly institutions. The Royal Society of London, founded in 1660, but particularly influential in this period, supports the publication of numerous natural history researches. The Geological Society, created in 1807, focuses on the composition and stratification of the Earth, opening up debates that will challenge the biblical narrative of a recent creation. The universities of Cambridge and Edinburgh become centers of scientific teaching and discussion, where a culture of clubs and correspondences flourishes. Collections of specimens, whether fossils, birds, or plants, feed the growing curiosity for observation and classification. Within the education provided at Cambridge, one work holds a prominent place: William Paley's Natural Theology, published in 1802. Paley develops the idea that the harmony and complexity of the living world testify to a divine design, comparable to the intervention of a watchmaker. According to him, the perfection of organic structures, for instance, the human eye, can only be explained by the will of a benevolent creator. This approach, which reinforces a teleological view of nature, resonates widely in circles of future clergy naturalists. At Cambridge, it is repeated that science and religion walk hand in hand, with precise observation of phenomena not detracting from the hypothesis of a higher intention that permeates creation. These intellectual currents, whether they pertain to descriptive botany, nascent geology, or speculative theology, gradually contribute to redefining the way nature is viewed. In London, salons or provincial amphitheaters, people passionately discuss fossils discovered in quarries, the mechanism of adaptation of species to their environment, or even the possibility of a creation in successive stages. Correspondences circulate, exchanging observations, hypotheses, or samples. Academics, doctors, and enlightened amateurs come together in local societies to enrich their understanding of living organisms. The most ambitious dream of establishing a unified theory that would account for the variety of the organic world. In this context, the idea of transforming the empiricism of collections into general principles is gradually taking hold, even though many scholars still refuse to abandon providential interpretations. At the same time, the dissemination of scientific periodicals and reports of experiments, particularly in chemistry and physics, energizes exchanges between researchers from various backgrounds. Debates are held on the dating of the Earth and on comparative anatomy, stimulating curiosity about the similarities between species. It is noted, for example, that the bone structure of vertebrates exhibits striking similarities, whether it be a bird, a batrachian, or a mammal. In medical faculties, the study of embryonic development highlights similar stages among different animal families, nurturing the idea that life might follow dimorphic or genetic laws yet to be discovered. This interest in unifying models, coupled with the ability to observe and catalog nature with ever-increasing precision, raises questions about the origin of species and the nature of the mechanisms governing their changes. Bold minds then envisage going beyond the established order, seeking evidence of a deep kinship between all living beings. The birth of Charles Darwin on February 12, 1809, took place in a family context, mixing science, industry, and a kind of intellectual curiosity that would mark his entire life. His father, Robert Darwin, was a reputed physician who inherited not only a certain financial ease, but also a profound respect for research and the systematic study of nature. His mother, Susanna Wedgwood, belonged to the family of famous porcelain makers, whose name was already nationally recognized. This cross-heritage, both medical and industrial, offered young Charles a conducive environment for reflection and the meticulous observation of the surrounding world. Located in the town of Shrewsbury, in the county of Shropshire, England, the family home benefited from a rich and stimulating rural environment. In early 19th century England, the natural sciences were still largely influenced by Ancien Regime conceptions, but curiosity about animal specimens, rocks, and plants was no less keen. Young Charles, encouraged by his father's erudition, was able to develop a strong taste for collecting and observing at an early age. The surrounding gardens, woods, and fields were an ideal exploration ground for a mind eager for discoveries and explanations. Moreover, the family setting, enhanced by learned discussions among friends and relatives, allowed him to ask questions about the origin of living beings, the differences between species, and the diversity of minerals. From childhood, he learned to handle the equipment necessary to preserve his finds, be they insects, shells, or rare stones. It was in this rural setting that Darwin discovered the simple pleasures of hunting and fishing, activities common among the provincial bourgeoisie. He practiced tracking game, cleaning and preparing the fish samples he brought back, while perfecting his sense of observation. The rivers and fields offered inexhaustible subjects of study, ranging from aquatic insects to amphibians hidden among the reeds. As he grew, his interest in analyzing natural phenomena went hand in hand with a certain curiosity about everything out of the ordinary. Family members regularly noted Charles's passion for long walks, which often ended with baskets filled with rocks or shells to study. In parallel, the familial tradition of scientific rigor, inherited from his paternal grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, a physician and philosopher known for his naturalist poems, permeated Charles's education. Even though he hadn't read his ancestors' writings in detail during his early childhood, he was immersed in an atmosphere where questioning and discovery were part of the family values. This scholarly inclination was combined with both philosophical discussions and practical field work. Every rock found, every insect captured, became a pretext for taking notes, drawing diagrams, and attempting to classify the variety of creatures and objects collected, even in a rudimentary order. Early on, Charles showed a particular interest in insects, specifically beetles, those small armored beetles, whose diversity already impressed the collectors of the time. In Shrewsbury, hedges, fallen tree trunks, and field edges teemed with these tiny creatures. Armed with small jars, handcrafted nets, and boxes lined with cork, he went out in search of new species he hoped to identify. The Linnaean nomenclature prevailing at the time, developed by the Swedish naturalist Carl von Linné, made it possible to classify and compare the collected specimens. For a curious teenager, this approach went beyond the simple pleasure of catching insects. It opened the door to understanding an order, an underlying structure to the diversity of life. Shrewsbury School, where Charles was admitted during his adolescence, adhered more to the educational standards of the time, focused on the study of Latin and Greek than on natural sciences. The headmaster, Samuel Butler, emphasized the rigor of classical disciplines, believing that knowledge of ancient languages trained the mind for all forms of reasoning. Darwin, however, was not enthusiastic about these repetitive school exercises. He much preferred rummaging through the inner courtyard and surrounding gardens in search of specimens rather than immersing himself in translating ancient texts. His teachers reported that he often seemed distracted in class, but was particularly adept at asking questions when he spotted a phenomenon that intrigued him outside of class hours. This practical curiosity and keen observation found an endless playground in the surroundings of Shrewsbury. The forests, damp plains, and banks of the Severn, the main river of the region, were microcosms where Darwin could scrutinize birds, spot unusual plants, or gather interesting stones. He conducted numerous small experiments, like testing the resistance of certain insects to heat or observing the reaction of a mushroom when placed in a confined environment. Gradually, these exercises led him to perceive nature as an interconnected system, much more complex than suggested by the school textbooks of the time. He enjoyed sorting, cataloging, and sometimes dissecting samples to understand their internal structure, always within a methodology he refined with each opportunity. Within this dynamic, a striking anecdote illustrates the young collector's determination, the so-called "three beetles, two hands" story. During a countryside outing, Darwin spotted successively 3 rare specimens he absolutely wanted to keep. After catching one in each hand, he was confronted with the necessity of capturing the third, even more exceptional, without sacrificing anything. In a burst of enthusiasm, he took it between his teeth to bring it back intact, but the insect, likely a bombardier beetle, released a sharp liquid that irritated Charles's mouth and forced him to release it. This misadventure, painful and comical at the same time, highlighted the fervor that drove him whenever it was about enriching his collection. It also underscored the need for caution, even when one is carried away by passion. Despite this misadventure, Darwin persevered, always encouraged by his family, who provided him with books and more suitable equipment. His insect boxes accumulated, now labeled with care. In addition to beetles, he also showed interest in fossils and minerals, scrutinizing shapes, textures, and colors to better grasp their diversity. Each discovery fed a mental inventory where every detail mattered, from shell shades to variations in insect appearance. This meticulous method already heralded the scientific approach he would gradually refine in his mind later on. When he arrives in Edinburgh in the fall of 1825, Charles Darwin is only 16 years old. Born in 1809, he now finds himself at a turning point where his family's expectations, particularly those of his father Robert Darwin, push him toward medicine. At the time, the University of Edinburgh was renowned for its quality medical education, attracting many students from all over the United Kingdom and even from further afield. The often crowded lecture halls evoke great intellectual excitement, while the city, bathed by the Forth estuary, offers numerous opportunities for maritime exploration. Despite the family injunction to pursue surgery, Darwin already harbors a strong interest in nature, which he observes with growing avidity. The surgery of the time, devoid of any form of anesthesia, demanded extreme composure from practitioners and often represented a harrowing spectacle for students. Operations were performed live, sometimes in makeshift operating rooms where cleanliness was questionable. Sensitive and reluctant to bear the sight of blood, Darwin sought means to escape the most burdensome classes. His aversion grew when he attended dissections he deemed particularly cruel, gradually fueling his desire to distance himself from this specialty. Yet, he continued to follow some mandatory courses, still hoping to discover an aspect of science that would suit him better. Beyond surgery, Edinburgh offered a wide array of theoretical and practical courses in internal medicine, anatomy, and chemistry. Darwin discovered renowned professors there, but he felt his motivation decline as he became familiar with the everyday life of a medical student. Less attracted by the sometimes heavy atmosphere of dissection amphitheaters, he was, however, enthusiastic about the teachings related to natural history. He seized every opportunity to examine specimens of plants, mollusks, and crustaceans preserved in university collections. This scientific curiosity, already present during his childhood in Shrewsbury, was abundantly fed by the resources offered by the Scottish city. Quickly, his steps led him to the coast and the port, where small fishing boats and merchant ships circulated constantly. The sea air, filled with spray, attracted him more than the overwhelming smell of formalin in the laboratories. During outings organized by some professors or undertaken on his own initiative, he collected seaweeds, sea urchins, and shells on the rocky beaches. He sometimes used nets to gather small invertebrates, which he then studied under a magnifying glass or microscope, thus perfecting his collection method. This practical approach, combined with dives into scientific documentation, helped him develop a more precise vision of marine biodiversity. These seaside expeditions were not limited to superficial observation. Darwin learned to preserve specimens using various techniques: immersion in alcohol, drying on boards, or chemical fixation to preserve shapes and colors. The institution encouraged this type of fieldwork as the university collections participated in a significant effort to catalog marine fauna and flora. Under these circumstances, Darwin began to master the rigor necessary to correctly label each specimen, note its discovery location, and specify the collection date. This method would become a valuable asset during his future research, which would extend well beyond the Scottish coasts. In parallel, Darwin discovers the Plinian Society, a student club where debates about natural history and emerging theories are conducted with an unusually open tone. Founded to encourage scientific discussion among young enthusiasts, this society is named after Pliny the Elder, a first-century Roman scholar specialized in the encyclopedic study of nature. Meetings take place in a buzzing atmosphere where sometimes bold theories are subjected to critical examination by peers. It is here that Darwin meets the biologist Robert Edmund Grant, who is already convinced that species are not fixed, but capable of transforming over long periods. Influenced by Lamarck's ideas, Grant advocates a concept of transformism that intrigues and sometimes shocks more conservative minds. By becoming more actively involved in the Plinian Society, Darwin finds a space for his first public contributions. He writes reports on marine observations, presenting, for instance, descriptions of little-studied small crustaceans or remarks on the distribution of particular algae in the Bay of Edinburgh. These interventions sometimes spark lively exchanges, as they can challenge established categorizations. He then understands that beyond collecting and describing, it is important to propose interpretations that help better understand the dynamics of living things. For the first time, he feels the thrill of confronting his ideas with the judgment of an assembly of peers, discovering the essential power and rigor of reasoned scientific discourse. Darwin then approaches key figures in the academic community, seeking advice and validation. He sometimes collaborates with Grant to analyze collected specimens, becoming familiar with methodical dissections which, although they remind him of his surgery classes, intrigue him more when aimed at understanding the organization of marine animals. The premises of the Plinian Society, located within the university, become a crucial point of reference for him, where he meets other students ready to exchange notes and discoveries. As his knowledge deepens, he realizes that the scientific method requires a marriage between meticulous observation and open-mindedness to innovative theories. This awareness heightens his desire to abandon the rigid path of medicine to fully embrace natural history. Shortly after his stay in Edinburgh, Charles Darwin arrives in Cambridge in 1828. He enrolls at Christ's College, a part of the University of Cambridge. At that time, it was common for young Englishmen to follow the ecclesiastical path, as becoming a country pastor offered a stable job and free time for scientific observation. Darwin thus adopts this orientation, even if he doesn't harbor a great religious enthusiasm. His father, Robert Darwin, approves of this choice, seeing it as a respectable compromise for a young man passionate about hunting and collecting specimens. At Christ's College, he discovers an environment where intellectual exchanges and ancient traditions mix intensely. Very quickly, Darwin becomes connected with John Stevens Henslow, a botanist known for his scientific rigor and his sense of pedagogy. An attentive professor, Henslow urges his students to confront theory with field observations. He demands the keeping of a methodical notebook, dedicated to every observation and reflection. For him, only meticulous observation shapes the scientific mind. Darwin, already fascinated by nature, then roams the countryside around Cambridge to collect plants and insects. He familiarizes himself with Carl von Linné's binomial nomenclature, which allows for the methodical classification of species. This systematic approach will serve him later when he explores other continents. Thanks to Henslow, Darwin discovers a network of professors and researchers who gather in scientific clubs. These very active discussion circles address botany, geology, and zoology. Darwin takes advantage of these meetings to expand his knowledge and confront his hypotheses. He listens to presentations on the latest discoveries in Europe or distant territories, thus fueling his desire for exploration. Henslow, aware of Darwin's potential, introduces him to influential figures, facilitating the dissemination of his early observations. The diversity of viewpoints at Cambridge, between curious young minds and seasoned professors, gradually broadens the intellectual horizon of the future naturalist. In the summer of 1831, Darwin receives an invitation from Adam Sedgwick, a renowned geologist. They head off together to Wales to map out rock strata that are still poorly understood. There, Darwin learns to wield a geologist's hammer to observe the arrangement of layers and to meticulously record his discoveries. The long walks through hills and valleys, punctuated by fossil observations and stratigraphic measurements, convince him of the fundamental role geology plays in understanding the deep history of the Earth. Sedgwick shows him how a current landscape can reveal events that occurred millions of years ago, provided one systematically studies the slightest clues. This concrete, demanding approach leaves a lasting impression on Darwin, who draws from it a working method based on patience, precision, and respect for observable facts. Parallel to these excursions, Darwin immerses himself in the texts of William Paley, whose Natural Theology remains a key work at Cambridge. Paley describes a universe so perfectly organized that it reflects the action of a benevolent creator. He presents the analogy of a clockwork mechanism. Just as a watch requires a watchmaker, the complexity of living beings, according to him, necessitates a providential design. At the same time, Darwin studies the first volumes of Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell, published in 1830. Lyell asserts that geological phenomena can be explained by slow and regular processes. This uniformitarian view, which opposes catastrophism, expands the timescale far beyond the idea of a recent world. Darwin is captivated by the idea that natural forces, acting over long periods, can shape the landscape and influence the evolution of life. Thus, he finds himself at the crossroads of two conceptions, one exalting supernatural design, the other emphasizing gradual natural mechanisms. Despite these opposing influences, Darwin's education remains that of a future clergyman. He takes theology courses, moral philosophy, and teachings that deepen knowledge of ancient languages, often required for preaching and participating in the theological debates of his time. In this context, the study of natural sciences is not seen as a discipline separate from faith, but rather as a way to better understand divine work. Henslow, himself a believer, considers science as an extension of religious reflection. However, Darwin begins to glimpse a potential conflict between the idea of direct providential intervention and natural mechanisms operating over immense periods. In the absence of certainties, he keeps his budding doubts to himself. Anyway, his enthusiasm for botany and geology occupies him fully. Each rural excursion, each discussion in university salons, feeds his curiosity and makes him hope that one day he could participate in a larger-scale scientific expedition. Within Christ's College itself, Darwin maintains a constant interest in reading. He discovers not only Paley and Lyell, but also older works dealing with natural philosophy and travel observations. For example, Pliny the Elder's Historia Naturalis, though outdated scientifically, intrigues him with its accounts of an inexhaustible variety of species. The tales of explorers such as Alexander von Humboldt, who traveled through Latin America at the turn of the century, particularly fascinate him. Humboldt describes the lushness of the tropical forests, the Andean glaciers, the most unusual fauna, and above all, a scientific method that includes multiple disciplines to understand the balances of nature. Darwin is passionate about these expanded perspectives, where geography, meteorology, botany, and chemistry converge. He dreams of leaving the confined framework of England to see with his own eyes these distant lands and mysterious phenomena that he knows only through maps and accounts. Meanwhile, he continues to practice scientific rigor by compiling precise notes on every plant, insect, or fossil he encounters. He sometimes experiments with dissections and compares specimens to spot similarities or anomalies. Despite the absence of an official research program, he gradually builds a true mental laboratory where notions of theology, geology, botany, and zoology interconnect. At Cambridge, the confrontation of these various fields is facilitated by an intellectual climate open to debates. The students discuss not only scientific issues, but also societal, political, and moral problems. This stimulating atmosphere, combined with the advice of Henslow and Sedgwick, leads Darwin to refine his curiosity and perfect his investigative method. He learns especially to observe without prejudice, to note without omission, and to synthesize everything into clear hypotheses. On the eve of his departure for an adventure he does not yet foresee, he is already prepared to dive into an immense world where discoveries in nature will soon overflow the simple framework of natural theology. His curiosity is in constant awakening. The voyage aboard the HMS Beagle, as it was envisaged at the end of 1831, stems from a singular proposal from Captain Robert Fitzroy, a young officer of the Royal Navy. Fitzroy, born in 1805, had already distinguished himself for his skills as a hydrographer and his scientific rigor. Charged with a new circumnavigation mission, he wished to take along a companion who would not simply be a subordinate officer, but a cultured observer, free to move and able to collect data on natural history across various regions of the globe. It was in this spirit that he extended the invitation to Charles Darwin, then 22 years old, during the summer of 1831. At the time, Darwin was still a theology student at Christ's College, Cambridge, while already nurturing a burning passion for geology and biology. At first, the prospect of such a journey frightened Darwin. His youth, his relatively affluent social status, and the fact that he did not yet have an official profession raised some doubts in his mind. He wondered if it was reasonable to leave the ordinary path, which led to a life as a country pastor, to embark on such an uncertain adventure. Moreover, this expedition did not promise a convenient trip, but a long and perilous voyage around the world, with its duration yet to be confirmed. Fitzroy, known for his meticulousness in nautical preparations and his demands for discipline on board, wanted to ensure that Darwin would not occupy a strictly passive role. He believed that the explosion of information collected at each stop, surveys, samples of flora and fauna, astronomical observations, would require a keen and versatile mind. He wanted to avoid simply having a passenger devoid of scientific curiosity. The invitation, while prestigious, was met with reluctance by Charles's father, Dr. Robert Darwin. He, a highly reputed doctor in Shrewsbury, feared that this expedition might divert his son from any stable and respected career. In his view, a worldwide voyage on a military ship, even if filled with scientific projects, seemed more like a youthful escape than a true professional commitment. Dr. Darwin was also concerned about the health risks for Charles, who had already shown a sensitive constitution. Apart from the maritime hazards, there was the possibility of catching unknown diseases in exotic lands. These sincere and protective reservations could easily dissuade a young man still undecided. Yet, Darwin kept in a corner of his mind the glimmer of a unique chance to discover the wonders that the rest of the world could hold. It was then that Charles's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, entered the scene. Married to Darwin's aunt, Wedgwood was a British entrepreneur and industrialist, heir to the famous Wedgwood pottery. His pragmatic and innovative personality made him receptive to the newness of the era. Having seized the opportunity presented to his nephew, Wedgwood wrote a reasoned letter to Dr. Darwin, in which he addressed all paternal objections point by point. He emphasized that this voyage was not a mere escapade, but an enriching experience for both Charles's scientific reputation and the general benefit of knowledge. He also highlighted the growing importance of geographical knowledge for England, engaged in colonial and naval rivalries on a global scale. The imperial dimension, supported by scientific curiosity, gave the journey a legitimacy that Dr. Darwin had to acknowledge. Wedgwood finally argued that accompanying a captain as methodical as Fitzroy offered guarantees of seriousness and prudence. Convinced by Josiah Wedgwood's arguments, Dr. Robert Darwin eventually granted his permission. Charles, relieved and elated, immediately set about preparing for his departure. Fitzroy's instructions regarding scientific equipment were detailed. First of all, precise instruments were needed to measure position in latitude and longitude, notably marine chronometers, a sextant, a compass, perhaps an artificial horizon, and materials to note daily observations. For the collection of geological samples, Darwin invested in several hammers, chisels, and canvas bags of different sizes. Botany and zoology also required an array of glass vials and dissection tools, as well as chemical solutions for preservation and herbarium bags for the flora. The wooden crates for shipping the collections from distant stops to England had to be robust to withstand shocks and humidity. Darwin also relied on his regular correspondence with John Stevens Henslow, his former botany professor at Cambridge. Henslow had played a key role in Darwin's early steps into the natural sciences. In a mission protocol approach, Darwin prepared notebooks and committed to sending written reports to Henslow, as well as crates of specimens that he deemed remarkable for the scholarly community. Meanwhile, other contacts, such as the geologist Adam Sedgwick, were curious about potential geological discoveries. Darwin, still a novice but endowed with an insatiable enthusiasm, already imagined himself traversing distant shores, scrutinizing the Earth's strata in search of clues about the planet's global history. In his luggage, he could not forget a number of books. Reference works in geology, such as Charles Lyell's volumes on the principles of geology, would hold a special place. Darwin also took along texts of natural theology, such as those by William Paley, echoing his education at Cambridge. He finally packed a Bible, expected for a young man theoretically destined for pastoral work, as well as various titles of European literature that he considered useful for general culture and for occupying long sea crossings. The departure was approaching, and the Beagle was already docked, undergoing its final preparations. Initially built as a war sloop, it was extended and modified to meet exploration needs, measuring about 27 meters in length. It wasn't particularly spacious, and Darwin had to accommodate himself to a cramped cabin shared with his equipment crates. Intended to survey the South American coasts, the Beagle was to continue the hydrographic work begun on the previous voyage. Fitzroy hoped to accurately map the dangerous and little-known coastal segments from the Atlantic to the Pacific's far reaches. Although the initial departure date was set for the autumn of 1831, successive delays and technical adjustments prolonged the waiting period. Darwin had to linger in Plymouth, double-checking his notebooks, leaving his loved ones behind, and exchanging letters with Henslow to refine his collection methods. The autumn weather, humid and windy, already gave him a taste of the challenging weather conditions he would face at sea. Each day lost at port added more tension and impatience, while the crew checked the sails, provisions, and navigational buoys. Finally, the Beagle set sail from Plymouth on December 27, 1831. The first hours at sea were marked by a gray sky and contrary winds, conducive to seasickness from which Darwin suffered almost immediately. Since his childhood, he had never taken long sea journeys, and he abruptly discovered the discomfort of the constant rolling. Some anecdotes tell that he was half-invalid for much of the initial crossing, seizing any calm moment to drag himself on deck for some air, then hastily returning to his cabin whenever the agitation resumed. Despite everything, his eagerness to discover the unknown remained intact. His notebooks, from the very first days, filled with observations of marine life and the behavior of seabirds following the ship's wake. Fragments of floating coral or strange algae fueled his curiosity, and he strove, despite the nausea, to record everything of interest. In the early days of this epic journey, Darwin did not yet suspect how much the duration of the voyage would extend beyond initial forecasts. Fitzroy aimed for 2 years, maybe 3, depending on navigation conditions and unforeseen events. The boat would head towards the Cape Verde Islands, then descend along the South American coasts, before confronting the formidable Cape Horn, exploring the Pacific, and continuing to Australia to, in principle, complete the world tour. Until then, the idea of such an adventure might have seemed abstract, but it was now becoming tangible. Each sunrise revealed an unknown ocean and opened up a new path. Despite the limited comfort and the difficulties of maritime life, Charles's excitement did not wane. His eyes were already turned to the horizon, eager to set foot on foreign lands, collect extraordinary specimens, and send captivating reports back to Cambridge to fuel the curiosity of the scholars remaining at home. Fitzroy, for his part, ensured discipline was maintained on board and systematically organized the hydrographic surveys. He wished to chart precise maps of difficult coastal zones. The captain considered it imperative for the Royal Navy, armed with its maritime empire, to improve geographical knowledge, to secure its navigation lanes, and establish British presence in strategic regions. Darwin's participation seemed an additional asset, as the mission's reputation would also rest on the scientific discoveries reported back to England, whether they concerned geology, zoology, or botany. The beginnings of the First Industrial Revolution, the need to improve commercial routes, and the rivalry with other colonial powers drove England to support these expeditions, straddling imperial impetus and a taste for scholarly exploration. For his part, Darwin, leaning over the railing, often endured the waves that drenched his boots while trying to take notes. As soon as the sea calmed, he endeavored to set up his instruments on the deck, fully aware that conducting science on board demanded creativity and composure. Labeled flasks, geological observation notebooks, and dissection tools had to be accessible, organized as best as possible in a cramped environment. Daily tasks were numerous: checking the preservation state of collected specimens, analyzing seawater, taking the temperature, spotting pelagic fauna, all while remaining attentive to Fitzroy's signals to conduct astronomical and barometric readings at regular intervals. Without systematically carrying out these measurements, the mission could not result in any reliable mapping, nor reveal precise tidal variations so useful to future navigators. In this initial stage, each wave reminded him of the task's enormity. Darwin, weakened by the pitching, consoled himself by imagining the lush forests he would encounter in tropical regions, the diversity of life he might discover there, the rare specimens destined for British museums. To this were added his hopes of learning more about the planet's geological architecture. Conversations with Fitzroy, when the sea allowed, revolved around itinerary plans, sailing up a river to analyze fluvial deposits, examining a coastline at low tide, climbing cliffs to observe strata. This beginning of the Odyssey prepared Darwin for a discipline he had never practiced with such rigor, noting the exact time, location, and surrounding conditions in a methodical style, inspired by the guidelines of Henslow and Lyell. The Beagle continued its wake, and the gray silhouette of the English coasts faded behind the Atlantic spray. In 1832, after several days of rough navigation, the Beagle crossed the southern Atlantic latitude to gradually reach the Cape Verde archipelago. Darwin, a young naturalist still in the learning phase, immediately immersed himself in the methodical study of the reliefs and rock strata. The islands, born of ancient volcanic activity, hold interesting geological vestiges in the form of superimposed layers, sometimes strewn with fossil shells. Although the landscape seemed arid, Darwin observed that many shell fragments were found at levels significantly higher than the current shoreline. This anomaly, which he attributed to a gradual uplift of the ground, reinforced his belief that the Earth's crust experienced incessant variations, in line with the uniformitarian principles he read in Charles Lyell's texts. The volcanic slopes, often streaked with black and ochre, testified to the region's tumultuous history, where magma had shaped reliefs now eroded by wind and spray. He carefully recorded these clues in his notebook, noting the exact positions thanks to elevation and latitude readings provided by the crew. At this stage, the origin of the elevated layers ignited new reflections in Darwin on the past presence of the sea at unexpected altitudes. When the Beagle set course westward again, Darwin prepared to discover the Brazilian coastline, whose reputation for lush forests fueled his scientific curiosity and his wonder as a young traveler. Near Bahia, the ship's hull plowed through clear waters, immediately bordered by verdant vegetation. The calls of unknown birds and the damp scents of the canopy excited his imagination. On land, he roamed the tropical forest, whose density rivaled any naturalist experience he had had until then. Every step reserved its share of discoveries: gigantic trees covered in vines, colorful insects, iridescent birds, and agile monkeys. Darwin, notebook in hand, described the profusion of living forms and the apparent organization of this exuberant ecosystem. He noted the canopy, so high that it seemed to conceal another world, and marveled at the soil's complexity, rich in humus, where various fungi and molds thrived. The subtle fragrances of the plants, mingled with the surrounding humidity, produced a profound sensory impression. These observations, meticulously and passionately recorded, nurtured his emerging understanding of the relationships between species and their habitat. He gradually realized that biological diversity could extend far beyond what he knew in Europe, bringing to life the notion that the natural world still harbored countless secrets. In this enchanting environment, Darwin is nevertheless quickly confronted with a darker aspect of Brazilian reality: slavery, whose extent he discovers with astonishment and indignation. In the vicinity of Rio, wealthy landowners exploit coffee or sugarcane plantations, resorting to the forced labor of chained men and women. The living conditions of these people hint at a cruel economic system, which Darwin strongly disapproves of. He witnesses scenes of brutality, hearing stories of corporal punishment and family separations, which deeply hurt his sensibility. One day, he engages in an impassioned discussion with a defender of slavery, shocked by the latter's argument that sees the practice as an inevitable cog in colonial prosperity. Darwin, already driven by a humanistic sentiment, expresses his horror, arguing that the supposed inferiority of certain human beings is but a chimera, and that no moral justification can alleviate these abuses. While some of the Beagle's sailors share his rejection, others remain more ambivalent or resigned, recalling the social and economic entrenchment of this institution. The notes taken by Darwin reflect both his anger and his sorrow at the suffering he observes. This painful encounter with the reality of slavery will leave a lasting mark on his perception of justice and equality, and will sometimes be mentioned in his future writings, although this theme does not form the core of his scientific works. Continuing his journey south, the Beagle stops in Uruguay, where Darwin discovers the open green plains of the Rio de la Plata region. Here, the horizon stretches as far as the eye can see, and herds graze on vast estancias. The young naturalist enjoys the hospitality of the gauchos, those legendary horsemen who roam the pampas with extraordinary ease. Attentive to local customs, he admires their skill with the lasso, their sense of independence, and their rudimentary way of life, very different from the English circles he has known. The seemingly monotonous soil, however, hides priceless paleontological riches. The eroded banks of certain rivers reveal gigantic bones buried in loose strata. Darwin uncovers several skeletal fragments, some belonging to creatures extinct for millennia. He identifies remains of Megatherium, a colossal ground sloth, as well as jaws of Toxodon, a massive herbivorous mammal whose appearance remains subject to various hypotheses. Excitement grows as he understands that these fossils are scattered in the same geographic area where current quadrupeds still live, as if a succession of gigantic species had become extinct recently. In his correspondence, Darwin repeatedly mentions the state of conservation of these fossil remains, suggesting they do not belong to a past as distant as that of the dinosaurs, known mainly from much earlier European or North American finds. The idea that entire species could have disappeared recently challenges the dogma of a fixed creation. Eager to collect all possible clues, he sends crates of these fossils to England, where they will be examined by renowned anatomists and paleontologists, including Richard Owen. The confrontation of all these discoveries raises a multitude of questions for Darwin. Are species stable? Do they have an evolutionary history? What is the temporal extent of these extinctions? The first pieces of the puzzle come together, fueled by the direct observation of colossal bones unearthed in the pampas. The deeper study, when he returns, will help him conceptualize the notion of succession of types, the idea that entire lineages could renew over geological time. The exploration continues and constantly enriches his emerging scientific vision. Throughout his travels in Uruguay and then in Argentina, Darwin carefully records in his journal the variations in terrain, sedimentary formations, and the fauna inhabiting the steppe. He notices the presence of large birds like the rhea, some of which seem to him to belong to a distinct variety depending on the region. The pampas now imprints on his mind as an open-air laboratory, where nature, vast and immense, reveals to him mechanisms of renewal and disappearance. Conversations with the gauchos, anecdotes about the migrations of wild horses, and naturalistic observations highlight the importance of adaptation to the environment. Darwin notes the flora that resists windy conditions, then pauses. In 1833, Charles Darwin arrived in the vastness of Patagonia, a region he discovered after exploring the Atlantic coast of South America. The landscapes seem infinite there, vast plains devoid of trees, a vast and changing sky, and constant winds sweeping across the steppe. To the north, the transition zone to the Argentine pampas soon brings Darwin into contact with a new natural space, characterized by tall grasses and the presence of local horsemen, the famous gauchos. An atmosphere of freedom and isolation permeates the entire region, contrasting with the greener and more tropical image he had of the Brazilian coast. As he travels through these expanses, he notes rocky plateaus, tilted hills, and immense cliffs where fossil-laden sediments are exposed. Darwin then undertakes to examine the elevated marine deposits, convinced by his study of Charles Lyell's works that the Earth has long undergone gradual and constant changes. According to the Lyellian doctrine, it is the same geological processes, operating on a small scale over countless centuries, that are responsible for landscapes. Thus, when he observes the layers of fossilized marine shells embedded in the cliffs, Darwin understands that these regions have slowly risen above sea level. The geological layers offer proof of a complex history, punctuated by episodes during which Patagonia was submerged before rising again. This confirmation of geological gradualism, contrary to the great occasional catastrophes proposed by some scholars, supports his inclination in favor of a slow and continuous dynamic of the Earth's crust. A significant moment during this stay, the Darwin's Rhea episode, happens while Darwin is camping with his companions. They often see these large birds running across the plains. The Rheas, related to ostriches, are locally known as nandus. He had already observed the common Rhea, larger and more widespread, in Uruguay and on the edges of Argentina. But in southern Patagonia, he hears that there exists another form, slightly smaller, described by some gauchos as a distinct bird. Shortly after, Darwin finds himself hunting for meat, and, in the heat of the moment, he unknowingly eats a Rhea that seems different. Having noticed the animal too late, he retrieves it from what was left of the meal. It is partially cooked that he manages to recover enough feathers and fragments to make a scientific description. Beyond this fortuitous discovery, Darwin strives to improve his collection methods. He builds relationships with the gauchos, whom he considers exceptional horsemen, and sometimes hires them to help him move across the plains. These horsemen serve as guides, knowing the water points and identifying passable paths in a terrain that, despite its apparent uniformity, can be treacherous in case of rain or tides. Fascinated, he notes their hunting techniques, particularly how they use bolas to capture cattle or rheas at full speed. He also observes their lifestyle in the estancias, these large ranches, where horses and cattle graze freely in a semi-wild environment. These encounters allow him to gather anecdotes and information about the local distribution of certain animal species. On his part, Darwin constantly monitors the state of the scientific equipment he transports: jars, labels, flasks for conservation in alcohol or spirit of wine solution. Each specimen, whether a bone, a feather, or plant remains, receives a reference number linked to notes recorded in a notebook. He specifies the exact location, date, type of habitat, and sometimes the altitude if it is relevant. He knows that, upon returning to England, experts such as Professor Richard Owen will be able to compare these fossils to other specimens already catalogued in museums. The logistical discipline he imposes requires rigor and time. Many evenings after hunting or observing are dedicated to revising notes, packaging, and preparing crates for maritime shipping. Whenever a port offers itself, Darwin sends his crates to John Stevens Henslow and other correspondents, ensuring a continuous flow of discoveries to the British scholarly community. Days pass, punctuated by rides in the steppe and incursions near the cliffs. The cartographic surveys add to Darwin's numerous sketches, where he tries to describe the succession of sedimentary layers. When he comes across a deposit of intact marine shells, tens of meters above sea level, it reinforces his impression that Patagonia is an exemplary place to study the slow upheaval of the continent. He compares his conclusions with what he knows of Chile and Peru, countries affected by volcanism and earthquakes, and comes to consider the Andes Cordillera and Patagonia as part of a general tectonic movement across South America. In the Pampas, he is also confronted with the culture of estancias, held by owners often of Spanish or Creole origin, as well as mixed populations. The gauchos, for the most part, show sympathy and admiration for the young English naturalist who insists on examining the smallest rock formation. He begins to exchange, sometimes in rudimentary Spanish, about the fauna they encounter. It is in this way that he learns of solitary birds, small rodents, or maned wolves that locals call aguara guazú, more toward the northern frontier. Although Darwin does not always venture there himself, this abundance of stories from the inhabitants helps him visualize the mosaic of South American fauna. On the ethnographic level, Darwin notes the proud and independent character of the gauchos, accustomed to spending entire days on horseback moving herds. He mentions their ease in moving from one estancia to another to reunite with family or friends, as well as their style of dress, the poncho, the wide pants called bombacha, and the omnipresence of the knife. He does not fail to mention the robustness of these men, often meat lovers, who cook meat directly on embers in the open air. For Darwin, this cohabitation with them is an opportunity to observe the links between humans and the rest of the living world. He notes that the local fauna sometimes adapts to breeding practices, with certain carnivores following the herds in search of carcasses. Following entire days dedicated to hunting, Darwin is as interested in geological evidence of the past as in the current forms of life. Each time he finds a new fossil, he attempts to interpret its place in the stratigraphy, while wondering what links exist between these ancient remains and living species. His hypothesis is becoming clearer. Perhaps certain lineages have changed over time, evolving according to environments. However, at this stage, his thinking remains in gestation, nourished by the meticulous accumulation of observations. He knows that each specimen sent to England can eventually help reevaluate the classification of these animals and plants, especially as nomenclatures are rapidly evolving under the influence of Carl von Linné's work and those who followed him. The routine at the bivouac repeats itself. Early in the morning, the group sets off, Darwin with a notebook in hand, always ready to note the slightest variation in terrain or the presence of a different bird. The mule drivers and gauchos point out passages where the rock differs, where underground waters emerge, or where wild herds of antelopes graze in the more arid valleys. Sometimes, frustration arises when the wind picks up and the dust makes the journey arduous. Other times, it's the discovery of a canyon with richly fossil-laden walls that occupies him all day. There, Darwin takes out his hammer, collects rock samples, checks the layout of the strata, and tries to assess the height at which these shells are located relative to sea level. When evening falls and he settles by the fire, Darwin classifies and labels his finds, carefully wrapping the bones in paper or cloth lest they crumble. He then examines, in his notes, the best way to relate these observations to those previously made in Uruguay and further north, around Buenos Aires. He particularly compares the composition of limestone, the distribution of fossil species, and the simultaneous presence of some megatherium or toxodons that sometimes seem to coexist in certain layers. He attempts to explain these superpositions and reflects on the great movements of the Earth's crust that led to the formation of modern Patagonia. The clues of uplift, so clear in the coastal cliffs, are also observed more inland. Darwin sees correlations between the Patagonian strata and other sites already mentioned by Lyell in his publications on world geology. As he progresses through this vast region, Darwin encounters different local communities, some of which speak dialects derived from indigenous populations. Some oral histories suggest that the ancestors of these people hunted immense lazy beasts and collected their bones, though without clearly distinguishing between legend and reality. Darwin listens, compares with what he has read from other explorers, and aims to distinguish speculation from direct observation. His ethnographic notes on the people he meets remain limited, as his main interest remains in the study of nature and the geological implications on species distribution. However, he takes care to note certain cultural practices, such as celebrations where the consumption of mate goes hand in hand with the sharing of stories and songs, or the habit of branding cattle with a red-hot iron, a symbol of ownership, spreading across these territories at the border between the colonial world and the almost unexplored vastness. Concurrently, the idea of a more global classification is reinforced. Each new bird, each fossil remains, each variation of animal form, such as this smaller rhea, suggests that nature is not fixed in a single state. He seeks to confront his findings with the Linnean system, which proposes a binomial nomenclature that allows the naming and grouping of species according to criteria shared by the scientific community. However, the discovery of Darwin's rhea shows that classifications continue to evolve as new specimens are identified. The somewhat comical scene where he and his companions savor the unknown fowl before declaring its identity illustrates his enthusiasm for direct observation and his desire to collect, down to the last detail, tangible evidence of the diversity of life. The regular dispatch of sealed crates to England constitutes the backbone of Darwin's approach. A steady flow of letters accompanies these packages, detailing what they contain, the exact location where the specimens were collected, and the conditions of their discovery. This method relies as much on trust in his correspondence as on the certainty that these objects, once studied by specialists, will enrich the base of knowledge shared between naturalists. It is also a way to confront his hypotheses. He eagerly awaits feedback on the dating of fossils, the state of preservation of animal fragments, or the degree of relatedness between two similar-looking species. In 1834, the HMS Beagle continues its exploration along the South American coasts under the direction of Captain Robert Fitzroy. On board, Charles Darwin methodically records everything he observes, from the coastline to steep altitudes, to better understand the geological formation of this vast continent. After traversing Patagonia, the crew must head northward to Chile to continue hydrographic surveys and map portions of the coast still poorly known by Europeans. Upon arrival at the port of Valparaiso, Darwin is struck by the signs of seismic activity that characterize the region. Local accounts concur in describing occasional tremors, accompanied by slight subsidence of land. This environment, seemingly peaceful at first glance, is nevertheless one of the most geologically active in the world. At the end of the year 1834, crossing the Andes mountain range requires considerable effort. The steep slopes, rocky paths, and altitude severely test both men and beasts. Darwin, who continues his research on the internal structure of the mountains, collects rock and fossil samples at each stop. Chilean mule drivers and local guides often see him scrutinize the outcrops with a magnifying glass, record descriptions in his notebooks, and meticulously pack fragments for later examination. As the expedition gains some altitude, Darwin is astonished to discover marine shells embedded in the rock walls. He notes that several thousand meters above sea level, these ancient marine remains indicate that the Cordillera was slowly uplifted over great geological periods. This discovery strengthens his belief in a perpetually transforming Earth, an idea already suggested by the readings of Charles Lyell, whose book Principles of Geology has accompanied him since the start of his voyage. Difficult weather conditions sometimes slow the team's progress. During the rainy season, the muddy roads inland become impassable. In these moments of forced pause, Darwin converses with the locals about past earthquakes, gathering their memories and legends. According to some oral accounts, major tremors were preceded by underground rumblings, like a distant rolling. Other inhabitants describe the fleeting retreat of the sea before a major quake, a phenomenon Darwin mentally compares to tsunami stories heard at other stops. This accumulation of observations prompts him to formulate hypotheses on the recurrent impact of these cataclysms in the very formation of the coast and on the gradual elevation of the land. At the beginning of 1835, as the Beagle continues its investigations further south, a powerful event will leave a lasting impression on Darwin's mind. On February 20th, 1835, a devastating earthquake strikes the city of Concepcion in central Chile. Darwin is not directly on the scene at the time of the tremor, but he arrives shortly afterward, accompanied by other members of the expedition, to assess the extent of the damage. The mud and adobe dwellings are largely reduced to ruins. Churches and official buildings, supposed to be more solid, are nothing more than heaps of broken stones and wood. The local population, psychologically shaken, gathers in the surrounding plains, far from the weakened structures. Darwin describes the scene with precision: cracked walls, broken streets, collapsed roofs, and smoke still rising from some fires ignited by the disaster. Near the coast, the land has been raised by a few dozen centimeters in places. Darwin notices while walking along the shore that some rocks on which marine algae used to grow are now above the water's surface. Mollusks and crustaceans, accustomed to the tidal zone, are now exposed to the open air, a blatant proof of a sudden ground uplift. To him, this illustrates on a grand scale the concept of cumulative gradualism. A series of earthquakes, each raising a portion of the coast more or less perceptibly, can lead to a significant elevation movement over the long term. He mentally compares this phenomenon with the marine shells perched in the Andean heights, thus linking the current drama to the slow geological history of the region. In Concepcion, Darwin manages to interview witnesses who saw the sea withdraw unusually, then return in waves larger than usual. These descriptions, compared to the data collected in other regions of the globe, lead him to consider that these massive water displacements are part of a general phenomenon. He takes numerous notes in the hope of contributing to a better understanding of the coastal dynamics linked to earthquakes. This scientific approach, consisting of multiplying viewpoints and aggregating various observations, already characterizes his method of work, rigorous and open to seemingly anecdotal details. By examining layers of sediments, he identifies disturbed areas showing that similar events occurred in the past. The repetition of the phenomenon, linked with current testimonies, further reinforces his intuition on the immense time scale necessary for the complete formation of the Cordillera. Beyond geology, Darwin and the crew continued to venture further south to reach Tierra del Fuego, a remote area at the tip of the continent where the transition between sea and mountains is much less populated. There, he faced the harsh climate. Violent winds, icy rains, and dense fog made the journey by boat perilous. In these austere lands lived the Yagans, an indigenous population that missionaries attempted to evangelize. One individual, now famous, was nicknamed Jemmy Button by the British sailors, an English sobriquet deriving from his previous history. Captured, taken to Great Britain at a previous time, and then brought back to his homeland, he served as a cultural intermediary. For Darwin, this encounter fueled a broader reflection on the diversity of lifestyles and the adaptability of humans to extreme conditions. The missionaries, settled in precarious camps, tried to teach agriculture and the Christian religion to the Yagans. Darwin observed, sometimes with reservation, how these efforts of conversion and civilization clashed with local realities. The indigenous populations, at times receptive, at other times skeptical, adhered to ancestral traditions and continued their subsistence practices mainly based on fishing, hunting, and gathering. In his journals, Darwin described their skill in navigating frail canoes, adapting to the relentless rain and winds, and surviving in these inhospitable regions. This clash between two worlds, that of the Western missionaries and that of the Yagans, prompted him to consider the question of cultural relativism. Each people develops survival strategies and beliefs that might seem peculiar to the foreign observer, according to their environment. He also perceived, despite marked differences, a common foundation, the unity of the human species, which manifested in curiosity, mutual aid, and the capacity for learning. Back in Chile, the Beagle's crew took the time to repair the ship, worn out by the multiple crossings in the channels of Tierra del Fuego. Darwin took advantage of this stop to embark on excursions into the hinterland in search of particular geological formations. He visited areas affected by the Concepcion earthquake, retracing the path of the main fault, studying the distribution of displaced rock blocks. He meticulously compared his measurements to descriptions made by Chilean engineers working to verify the solidity of recent constructions. These comparisons revealed striking coherences between Darwin's empirical observations and local technical surveys. Gradually, he suggested that these upheavals, in Chile as elsewhere, were primarily the result of successive small ruptures. Contrary to the catastrophist doctrines identifying rare major upheavals, Darwin relied on the regularity of these earthquakes to argue for a long and gradual process. This new perspective on tectonic activity became the cornerstone of his geological reflection. In the Andes themselves, Darwin devoted part of his days to exploring sites where even older marine fossils were found. The fossils of corals, mollusks, and crustaceans that surfaced at high altitude particularly inspired him. Each fragment enriched the thesis that these mountains were formed by the gradual elevation of seabeds over millennia. He compared the size, shape, and composition of these fossils to those he observed on the current coastline, noting a continuity that defied the notion of fixed temporal boundaries. The encounter with inclined sedimentary plates containing perfectly identifiable marine organisms fueled his desire to prove that an extraordinary amount of time is necessary to effect such planetary-scale changes. He then formulated the idea that the Earth's crust undergoes perpetual change. What was once an ocean can, many ages later, rise as a colossal mountain. When Charles Darwin arrived at the Galápagos in September 1835, he discovered an isolated archipelago, located about 1,000 kilometers off the South American coast. The volcanic landscapes, uneven vegetation, and endemic wildlife sparked his curiosity. He first observed the mockingbirds, each island hosting a slightly different variety. This difference in plumage or morphology led him to wonder if the birds shared a common origin, or if they had adapted separately. He also noticed the finches, future symbols of island diversity, although he did not yet realize their full importance. Keen to study these animals, he collected specimens but faced some labeling gaps, which would later complicate his precise analysis of the origin of each bird. The giant tortoises captivated his attention too. According to the shape of their shells, one could guess the island they came from. On the more arid islands, the shell's edge rises towards the front, allowing the tortoises to stretch their necks to reach scarce vegetation, while on more humid islands, they have a dome-shaped shell. Darwin understood that local ecological factors influence these anatomical variations and sensed an adaptive process at work. Although he did not yet explicitly name natural selection, he noted that geographic isolation could favor the emergence of distinct forms. After exploring several islands in the Galápagos, the Beagle continued its journey across the Pacific. Darwin stopped in Tahiti, the jewel of French Polynesia, where he compared the tropical flora and the luxuriance of the forests with the more austere landscapes of the Galápagos. He was interested in the contrasts in the layout of coral reefs and the ways the local populations exploited natural resources. The calm lagoons, bordered by corals, testified to a teeming marine biodiversity, very different from what he had seen previously. His interest in the structure of reefs grew as he wondered how these circular formations appear in the middle of the ocean. Next, New Zealand welcomed him with its vastly different environment, characterized by endemic bird species like the kiwi, which hardly knew mammalian predators. Darwin noted the relative trust of these animals towards humans and compared this behavior with that of South American birds. He understood that the remoteness from the continent had shaped unique ecosystems. Each archipelago, whether the Galápagos or Tahiti, presented its own ecological arrangements, dictated by geology, climate, and interactions between animals, plants, and humans. At this stage, Darwin was collecting observations that would feed his reflections on the geographical distribution of species. The journey continued in Australia, whose marsupial fauna surprised Darwin. The kangaroos, which he compared to herbivores from other continents, illustrated for him how prolonged isolation had generated unique animal lineages. Observing also the vast eucalyptus forests, he noted the bark that peels off in large plates, an adaptation to a sometimes dry environment. The settlers told him about the difficulties of acclimatizing imported plants, which echoed the variations he had already observed elsewhere. Each stop in these regions confirmed that all forms of life rely closely on local conditions, shaped by the geology and history of the land. The Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost point of Africa, also added to this mosaic of different biotopes. Darwin compared the Mediterranean vegetation of the Cape to that of Europe, while noting the presence of unique local plants, such as proteas. He was interested in the introductions of exotic species by the settlers, and examined how some quickly adapted, while others disappeared. Through all these experiences, he reflected on the links between geography, climate, and biological adaptation. Ideas about the slow transformation of ecosystems were solidifying in his mind. Still aboard the Beagle, Darwin rereads his notes on coral reefs, having already seen notable examples in the Galápagos and Tahiti. Gradually, he develops a theory to explain the formation of atolls. According to him, when a volcano rises in the tropical sea, corals attach to its edges, forming a fringing reef. If the volcano slowly sinks into the Earth's crust, the corals continue to grow towards the surface to remain at an optimal light depth. Eventually, when the volcanic summit is completely submerged, only a coral ring enclosing a lagoon remains. Darwin calls this hypothesis the subsidence theory, as it relies on the principle of a slow sinking of the base. He distinguishes three types of reefs: fringing reefs against coasts, barrier reefs further away, and atolls separated from any land. This explanation seems elegant and general to him, as it encompasses observations from multiple archipelagos in the Pacific Ocean. The Galápagos are of more recent volcanic origin, which explains, according to Darwin, the absence of massive atolls like those observed in Polynesia. The cold Humboldt Current also influences the water temperature around the archipelago, limiting the development of large coral reefs. In his eyes, this is another example showing that local conditions determine whether a creature or organism can establish itself. Thus, while giant tortoises thrive on these partially arid islands, corals find more favorable grounds for their development elsewhere. Darwin sees a vast canvas of interactions between the mineral world and the living kingdom. Beyond the simple geological formation, Darwin is interested in the ecological consequences of reefs on the species residing there. Corals indeed host a multitude of marine animals: colorful fish, crustaceans, mollusks, and invertebrates, all dependent on the protective structure built by polyps. He also notes that the lagoons formed at the center of atolls offer refuge against swells and ocean storms. Sailors exploring these areas sometimes take advantage of these calm waters to anchor their ships in relative safety. Each atoll thus becomes a complete ecosystem with its own food chains. For Darwin, the study of these habitats demonstrates how geology and biology intertwine to shape unique living environments, just as insular isolation has altered terrestrial fauna in the Galápagos or Australia. When he returns to England in October 1836, Charles Darwin, a young naturalist aged 27, brings back a scientific treasure carefully packed in wooden crates, specimens of birds, mammals, fossils, and a multitude of observations recorded in his journals. After nearly 5 years aboard the HMS Beagle, he must now sort this mass of material to analyze it in depth. Very quickly, he calls upon recognized experts in their respective fields. John Gould, a renowned ornithologist working at the British Museum, examines the exotic birds gathered by Darwin, while Richard Owen, an eminent anatomist and paleontologist, is tasked with examining the fossil mammals, notably the large extinct quadrupeds of the South American plains. This collaboration allows precise identification of certain species brought back from South America, including fossil forms of giant sloths and ancient armadillos. As Darwin familiarizes himself with the conclusions of Gould and Owen, he begins to perceive the major issues raised by these discoveries. The variations observed in the finches of the Galápagos Islands or the remains of extinct animals highlight potential links between closely related living forms and their extinct ancestors. Darwin, trained in geology by Charles Lyell and Adam Sedgwick, understands that the Earth has undergone significant changes over time, but he now wonders how these geological alterations might be related to the gradual transformation of species. The crates piled in his new London home thus become the starting point for a new reflection on the origin and diversification of life. In 1837, Darwin began to record his thoughts in a series of notebooks, later known as the Transmutation Notebooks. In these small volumes, he scribbled sketches of evolutionary trees, suggesting a common ancestor for different lineages of creatures. On one of the pages, he wrote the words, "I think," just above a sketch linking several species with diverging branches. This simple comment served as a starting point, revealing his path to the hypothesis that all forms of life might share distant ancestors. At that time, the dominant view remained one of independent creation for each species, strongly supported by natural theology taught in universities like Cambridge. However, Darwin meticulously noted anatomical, embryological, and geographical similarities among populations, convinced that these resemblances were not coincidental. He compared his South American findings to those collected by other explorers to determine if recurring patterns emerged. Gradually, he forged the idea of continuity between past and present species, paving the way for the notion of common ancestry. His notebooks transformed into thought laboratories, filled with rapid notes, references to other scientific works, and observations drawn from his personal collections. The work of compiling and confronting facts intensified, placing Darwin in front of his early evolutionary intuitions. In 1838, in the midst of his reflections, Darwin read Thomas Robert Malthus's essay on the principle of population, first published in 1798. This work addressed the idea that population growth is faster than the increase of food resources, inevitably leading to a struggle for survival within each population. This notion of perpetual competition acted as a catalyst in Darwin's mind. Confronted with the immense variety of living beings, he understood that only the most advantageous traits would allow an individual to survive and reproduce in a demanding environment. In other words, the variations present in certain specimens could provide a selective advantage, increasing their chances of perpetuating their lineage. From this reading, Darwin articulated the idea of natural selection, driven by the constant pressure of the environment, a concept he compared to artificial selection performed by breeders to produce specific animal breeds. The impetus given by Malthus helped him understand why some species thrived, while others dwindled or disappeared. Nature itself, without external intervention, could select favorable traits, sealing the fate of each population over time. This was the conceptual spark that led him to the key mechanism of evolution, a gradual but relentless process offering a solid explanation for the extraordinary diversity of life. The year 1839 marked a turning point in Darwin's life when he married Emma Wedgwood on January 29th, thus solidifying an already close family connection. Emma was his first cousin from a lineage of porcelain manufacturers renowned throughout England. Before making this decision, Darwin meticulously drafted a list of pros and cons, weighing domestic comfort, companionship, and emotional stability against the risk of losing precious time for his research. Ultimately, he chose marriage, reflecting his desire to balance private life and scientific work. The young couple settled in a London house, where Darwin continued to organize his specimens and write his notes. The intellectual vibrancy of the capital allowed him to forge or strengthen valuable contacts with other men of science, such as Charles Lyell, Joseph Dalton Hooker, and the geologist Roderick Murchison. During this period, Darwin began privately discussing his ideas on the transmutation of species, while maintaining a certain public caution to avoid premature controversies. Despite his hesitations, he gradually built a core of scientific allies, likely to support his revolutionary conjectures. His new matrimonial life did not hinder his imagination, and the idea of a grand synthesis on evolution was already firmly taking root in his thoughts. In the course of the year 1839, while Darwin spends his time between married life and his various readings, he sees his home transform into a place of passionate scientific observation and discussions. His recent fossil discoveries, combined with information gathered from John Gould and Richard Owen, further nourish his hypotheses on the gradual alteration of species. The astronomical, geological, and botanical knowledge he acquires in the scholarly circles of London urges him to methodically delve into what he already calls a mystery of mysteries. Small reflection groups sometimes gather at his house, stimulating his critical mind and encouraging him to organize the multiple data into a coherent theory. However, the prospect of a public controversy remains worrisome, as questioning the fixity of species would jeopardize much more than purely scientific notions. Darwin, therefore, prefers to proceed with caution, secretly compiling the elements that underpin his reasoning. By the late 1830s, he is already sketching entire paragraphs aiming to illuminate the very dynamics of natural selection. In his notebooks, remarks on the distribution of species according to environment sit alongside broader inquiries, touching on the place of man in this great moving whole. Charles Darwin's decision to settle in Down, a small rural village in Kent County, in 1842 reflects his growing desire to distance himself from London's hustle and find a retreat where he could fully devote himself to his studies. This property, named Down House, was already a spacious home, surrounded by a large garden and bordered by orchards. Establishing in this region, about 25 kilometers southeast of the capital, also responded to Darwin's need to preserve his fragile health, strained since his return from the Beagle voyage. Seeking a calm atmosphere conducive to scientific observation, he began a new chapter of his life in this now iconic home. Down House was not just a simple family abode. It became a veritable private laboratory where Darwin could engage in botanical experiments, label his specimens, and undertake dissections when his health allowed. To foster a research routine, he arranged a circular path known as the Sand Walk. This path, laid out at the back of the garden, served as a daily walk and meditation space, ideal for organizing his thoughts and examining his scientific hypotheses. Darwin had the habit of taking several laps during the day, punctuating his steps with reflections on geology, botany, or comparative anatomy. He then preserved his observations in notebooks, which accumulated in his study. The health troubles Darwin had been suffering from for several years frequently manifested as gastric pains, nausea, and severe headaches. These symptoms were sometimes joined by palpitations and a general feeling of weakness, forcing him to carefully distribute his working hours. The mornings were often his most productive time. Waking early, he would sit at his desk to write his notes or examine his specimens with a magnifying glass. After a short rest, he tried to resume his activities in the afternoon, but often had to shorten his sessions due to fatigue. In this precarious balance, Down House played a protective role. The ambient tranquility of the place allowed an observation discipline adapted to his condition. Soon, Darwin undertook to formalize his reflections by drafting a first essay of about 35 pages, completed in 1842. This document was not intended for immediate publication, but aimed to clarify the main lines of a theory of the transmutation of species, then still little accepted in scholarly circles. The author gathered in it observations accumulated since the Beagle voyage, as well as hypotheses already sketched in his notebooks. Fearing he might run out of time, he wanted to ensure his ideas would not be lost if his fragile health were to worsen. At this stage, he was already discussing a common origin for life forms and a progressive mechanism, partly inspired by uniformitarian geology and some unresolved biological debates. In 1844, Darwin decided to greatly expand this initial essay to create a more detailed manuscript, culminating in some 230 pages. In this text, he better established the theoretical foundations of his future theory of natural selection, although he did not always call it that. He gathered geological, botanical, and zoological elements, while emphasizing the variations observed in domestic species. Aware of the potential controversy, he did not yet wish to make these reflections public. However, to guard against the risk of being unable to continue his work, he entrusted this document to his wife, Emma Darwin, instructing her to pass it on to a scientific friend if illness were to take the author of these lines before their completion. The voluntary isolation that Darwin imposed on himself at Down House offered him a discreet setting to undertake small experiments. In his garden, he observed the germination of seeds subjected to different conditions, sought to understand the dispersion of plant species, and took note of every detail likely to feed his reflections. His recurring migraines and capricious digestive system required him to break up his schedule. but he found in these occasional researches a means to focus on specific issues without embarking on long expeditions. When fatigue became too great, he interrupted his work and immersed himself in scientific readings, accumulating ideas that he then recorded in his notebooks when his condition improved. The correspondence Darwin maintained with Joseph Dalton Hooker, a renowned botanist, and Charles Lyell, a geologist already famous for having popularized the concept of uniformitarianism, played a crucial role during this period of retreat at Down. The letters were sometimes exchanged at a brisk pace, Darwin testing the validity of his geological interpretations or naturalistic observations with these seasoned researchers. However, he was careful not to reveal in detail the scope of his speculations on the transformation of species, sensing the magnitude of the debate that might ensue. His correspondence saw in it the seed of a new idea without grasping its full extent. Thus, thanks to this small and carefully chosen network, Darwin continued his investigations in relative discretion. In 1846, Charles Darwin engaged in extremely meticulous work on a group of marine organisms called cirripedes, more commonly known as barnacles. Although this choice might seem narrow compared to his broader musings on the transformation of species, it was a strategic decision to establish his reputation as an experienced naturalist through an in-depth taxonomic study. Following the success of some of his geological publications, he knew he had to prove his ability to examine a complex zoological field with the same degree of detail. The cirripedes, both familiar and little known, constituted an ideal research area. They attach to rocks, ship hulls, or other marine creatures, and exist in varied forms, making their species classification difficult. The young scientist shrewdly presumed that exploring their anatomy, reproductive habits, and geographical distribution would provide him with legitimacy as a specialist within the English scholarly community. He then decided to devote several years to dissecting countless specimens, comparing their peculiarities, and publishing exhaustive monographs on each of the main cirripede subgroups, both fossilized and living. This enterprise truly began when he got hold of specimens he had collected during the voyage of the Beagle, as well as others contained in the collections of the British Museum and the University of Cambridge. The study of barnacles presents considerable challenges. The internal anatomy of these animals is of unsuspected complexity and requires delicate dissections. For example, in some barnacles, the calcareous shell that protects the animal contains a body organization that had previously only been partially described by previous zoologists. Darwin quickly realizes that many species exhibit unexpected reproductive structures, particularly parasitic dwarf males, housed within or on the periphery of the female. Some groups seem practically hermaphroditic, while others retain more conventional reproductive strategies. He carefully notes these variations in his notebooks, sketches anatomical drawings, and strives to relate each form to a precise branch of the barnacle genealogical tree. His goal goes beyond mere description. Through these studies, he aims to better understand the diversity and plasticity of life in order to support the idea of progressive evolution. Thereafter, he devoted himself to writing specialized monographs, which he published in several volumes between 1851 and 1854. The first volumes dealt with the Lepatidae, a group of stalked barnacles, recognizable by their flexible stalk with which they attach themselves to diverse substrates. In this work, Darwin does not limit himself to classifying and externally describing each species. He dissects feet, gills, reproductive organs, and even some microscopic features often neglected. He compares individuals from very distant regions, such as those from European coasts and those found on tropical reefs. This comparative study reveals a great variety of intermediate forms, situated between taxa previously distinguished as clearly separate. This finding fuels his reflection on how species might, over time, distribute and diversify from common ancestors, undergoing slight cumulative morphological modifications. After examining the pedunculated barnacles, he continues with the Balaenidae, these sessile barnacles without a stalk. The importance of detail is such that he sometimes has to spend entire days examining a single individual, using a microscope and writing meticulous descriptions. He carefully measures the size of the calcareous plates, the shape of the openings, the arrangement and number of internal segments, as well as the peculiarities of the mouth parts, crucial for determining the diet. When he discovers in some species the presence of multiple tiny males attached to a significantly larger female, he deduces that barnacle reproduction presents an unsuspected plasticity capable of shedding light on broader biological questions. His colleagues are astonished by this revelation, which contradicts the comfortable idea of a well-defined sexual separation in the animal kingdom. Darwin, convinced that nature offers a mosaic of adaptive solutions, meticulously classifies these variations to better illustrate the innate complexity of life. Simultaneously, these taxonomic studies generate growing reputation within the Royal Society and the European scientific community. He begins to be called, not without irony, Mr. Barnacle, highlighting the scope and depth of his work on this seemingly modest but particularly difficult to grasp group. Although this joke circulates in some circles, the nickname also reflects the deep esteem some naturalists have for Darwin's colossal commitment to classification. Having previously published his geological and zoological observations drawn from his expedition, he now reinforces his authority by showing his determination to explore the slightest anatomical and behavioral subtleties of these small crustaceans. Thus, even those who were skeptical of the hypothesis of transmutation of species are forced to recognize his skills as an observer and taxonomist. This progressive recognition is essential because it helps lend weight to any future speculation on the mechanisms of variation and selection in the animal kingdom. The method he employs relies largely on the comparison of a wide range of specimens. From the outset, Darwin strives to build series reflecting the extent of the variations. He collects both typical individuals and others with rarer characteristics, found in extreme habitats or on unusual hosts. Each sample receives a number, a descriptive legend, and precise notes on its place of collection, date, and state of preservation. By cataloging all this data, he can detect the emergence of morphological nuances within species considered uniform, demonstrating that subtle variations manifest even in similar ecological contexts. This practice of meticulous observation and rigorous cataloging corresponds to a taxonomic tradition already well established among the naturalists of his time, but Darwin adds to it an insatiable curiosity for evolutionary dynamics. He thus begins to forge a global method, identifying bridges between field variations and the theoretical structure he develops around common origins and gradual transformations. His research, however, encounters obstacles. The magnitude of the task forces him to devote considerable time to repetitive and cerebral dissections, sometimes to the detriment of his already fragile health. He must also manage editorial pressure. Each volume demands a quality illustration, and the scientific engravers or illustrators are not always available or fast enough to meet his corrections. Moreover, he spends long hours comparing his conclusions with those of other European and American specialists who sometimes study collections of cirripedes from even different environments. Intense epistolary discussions arise as Darwin wishes to verify every detail, every hypothesis of synonymy or erroneous classification. He cross-references his observations with those of marine anatomists like Henri Milne-Edwards in France, and takes an interest in collections brought back from other oceanic regions, ensuring the robustness of his analyses. This rigor gradually strengthens the confidence of British naturalists in his work. Gradually, all the results take shape and clearly elucidate the relationships between various families of cirripedes. The monographs, published over several years, review not only the external and internal anatomy, but also the larval stages, the histology of the mouthparts, and the physiology of reproduction. Darwin examines notably the nauplius, a larva typical of a large number of crustaceans, and observes how its development leads to the definitive form, fixed or stalked, depending on the species considered. He proposes a reorganization of the existing taxonomy, moving certain forms from genera to other families, while describing new species along the way. His colleagues discover how the criterion of the shell, or of possible additional plates, is less relevant than the observation of embryonic morphology or the appendages used for capturing food. These adjustments cause some stir, as zoological encyclopedias need to be partially rewritten. But Darwin's approach is deemed irrefutable wherever he provides detailed proof. Moreover, his insistence on the question of sexuality makes an impression. The readers of his monographs learn that, in certain cirripedes, there exists both a main hermaphroditic individual and tiny complementary males. This peculiarity shocks those who see in nature a clearly defined place for each sex. Darwin thus provides a concrete example of heterodox adaptations. The ordinary individual, potentially capable of self-fertilization, nonetheless benefits from parasitic males, sometimes of microscopic size, increasing the possibilities of cross-fertilization. He describes precisely the position of these males, the size and shape of their reproductive organs, and compares these discoveries across several species. This study, which might have seemed anecdotal, becomes a strong argument to illustrate the profusion of evolutionary tactics in nature. Some scientists of the time respond with skepticism, but many of them end up highlighting the caliber of his direct observations. The controversies spill over into private correspondence or during meetings of the Geological Society and other scholarly societies, contributing to broaden Darwin's notoriety. In the early years of the 1850s, Charles Darwin undertook a series of experiments within the confines of his home at Down House, which would feed into his reflections on the evolution of species. He particularly focused on pigeon breeding, a very popular practice in Victorian England, where bird competitions rewarded the most ingenious breeders. By studying varieties like the fantail pigeons, whose tails spread out like a fan, or the tumblers with their peculiar gait, he noticed how much the hand of man could influence the morphology and behavior of these animals. Breeders, by carefully selecting breeders exhibiting the desired traits, plumage color, beak shape, head carriage, achieved spectacular results in just a few generations. Darwin saw an eloquent metaphor in what nature might achieve on a larger scale, over much more extended periods, through environmental factors. In parallel, Darwin extended his investigations to rabbits, poultry, and even plants, cultivated in his garden, aiming to discern the mechanisms generating diversity from the same angle. As with pigeons, he documented breeding or hybridization methods, the selection criteria used by horticulturists and farmers, as well as the variations obtained after several reproduction cycles. He meticulously noted the differences in size, shape, color, and resistance, seeking to determine to what extent a simple change in living conditions could accelerate or slow down the emergence of new traits. When gardeners favored plants with particularly large or fragrant flowers, they were, on a reduced scale, replicating the selective pressure that nature exerts on wild populations. According to Darwin, artificial selection, consciously operated by man, could serve as a model for understanding natural selection, which occurs unconsciously and gradually. In his notebooks, Darwin also recorded a series of tests intended to measure the feasibility of long-distance dispersal of species, a crucial point for explaining the geographical distribution of related organisms. He became interested in the resistance of seeds to saltwater by immersing different seeds in containers of seawater for days, even weeks, then planting them to see if they still germinated. Likewise, he assessed the ability of certain mud to adhere to birds' feet, simulating the involuntary transport of seeds over long distances. Through these experiments, Darwin developed the conviction that nature possesses multiple mechanisms, both simple and ingenious, to disperse life across continents and oceans. Seeds coated in seemingly trivial mud could cross seas and mountains by taking advantage of birds' migratory journeys. Long before pushing his domestic experiments this far, Darwin had already been struck by the behavioral proximity he perceived between humans and certain primates. In 1838, he visited the London Zoo to observe Jenny, a young female orangutan whose facial expression and gestures seemed so strangely familiar. Sitting by the cage, Darwin noticed her grimaces, her attentive gaze, and her skill in manipulating objects. He later recounted in his notes how much the animal's behaviors reminded him of a curious child, capable of boredom or delight, depending on the situation. This scene, anchored in his memory, reinforced the idea that the demarcation between humans and animals might not be as clear-cut as previously thought. The foundations of his evolutionary thinking, still unformulated, were gradually taking shape thanks to such concrete and unexpected examples. To strengthen his demonstrations, Darwin also sought the help of many correspondents across the country, whether they were breeders, gardeners, or amateur naturalists. He sometimes sent them small questionnaires to learn about their selection methods, their evaluation criteria, or the frequency at which they introduced new blood into their lineages. When he received detailed responses, he carefully compared this information with his own results, seeking remarkable constants or divergences. For example, he was interested in how to obtain rabbits with immaculate coats, the necessary crossbreeding to stabilize a variety of climbing rows, or the optimal breeding conditions for a newly emerged pigeon breed. With each new piece of data, he refined his argument in favor of variability and organisms' ability to adapt, consciously or not, to environmental demands. All this meticulous work was coupled with a sincere fascination with the complexity of life. In his notebooks, which Darwin sometimes called his notebooks on transmutation, he also described his various attempts to replicate the randomness of natural selection. For instance, he covered part of his vegetable garden with nets, altered watering or soil composition, and observed how some plants adapted or withered. He used different types of fertilizers, reduced light in certain areas, or encouraged the presence of pollinating insects by installing experimental beehives. Each modification aimed to test the resistance and variability of cultivated species in search of additional clues about the plasticity of life. In his letters to Joseph Dalton Hooker, a renowned botanist at Kew Gardens, Darwin discussed the significance of these results, hoping to identify universal mechanisms governing the emergence of new traits. This fascination led him to collect seeds and cuttings, never ceasing to confront theory and practice. When the British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace ventured into the Malay archipelago from 1854 onwards, he had already conducted various expeditions in the Amazon and amassed solid experience as an observer of nature. Settled in this region located between Southeast Asia and Oceania, he devoted his days to collecting zoological and botanical specimens, hoping to document tropical biodiversity for his financial backers in London. The living conditions, often trying, tested his health. Fevers, mosquitoes, and isolation contributed to creating a climate of vulnerability, but also intense reflection. It was through the repeated reading of Thomas Malthus's essay, published in 1798, that Wallace, at the height of a malaria crisis in 1858, came to formulate a remarkable hypothesis on the origin of species. He connected the idea of struggle for existence, proposed by Malthus, to the observation of the constant selection that nature wields on animal and plant populations. He then envisioned a process similar to the one Charles Darwin was exploring in England, natural selection as the engine of evolution. Wallace, without the same institutional network as Darwin, had nonetheless developed a keen awareness of the variability of living forms. His observations on the geographical distribution of animals, from Borneo to the Moluccas, reinforced this intuition that species were not fixed, but could gradually adapt to their environment. By imagining a coherent mechanism, Wallace joined the idea of evolution by natural selection without having directly communicated with Darwin. This parallel discovery, in conditions of relative scientific solitude, testified to the intellectual ferment of the time and the importance of Malthus as a catalyst. This context highlights the value of a comparative approach, as Wallace, observing exotic birds and shimmering insects on remote islands, arrived at conclusions similar to those of a colleague situated thousands of miles away, working at Downhouse on his own transmutation notebooks. The famous letter from Ternate, dated 1858, spectacularly concretized this convergence of ideas. Wallace, setting up his camp on the island of Ternate, sent Darwin a concise presentation of his theory, evoking the survival of the fittest, inspired both by Malthus and his own field investigations. Unaware that Darwin had been working for years on a much more detailed manuscript, Wallace sought his opinion and helped to publish his text. This letter placed Darwin in front of a complex moral dilemma. He realized that Wallace had just outlined the same fundamental hypothesis, even though he himself had not yet disclosed his project nor synthesized his research into a version intended for the public. Darwin, already tormented by the fear of provoking strong opposition, hesitated between giving all the priority to Wallace or finally deciding to make his own theory public. Pressure from his entourage was felt, as several scholarly friends knew that since 1837, Darwin had been annotating his notebooks to gradually formulate the concept of natural selection. The arrival of Wallace's letter thus accelerated the urgency of finding a fair and acceptable solution for both men. This situation underscores the ethical dimension inherent to scientific research at the time when the notion of intellectual property was not as formally established as it is today. For Darwin, the correspondence received from Ternate posed the question of honesty vis-à-vis a colleague who had, without being aware, reached a major inflection point in biological thinking. Facing this context, he turned to his friends Charles Lyell and Joseph Dalton Hooker, influential representatives of the scientific establishment, for advice. Charles Lyell, a renowned geologist and close friend of Darwin, was already aware of Darwin's evolutionary reflections, although he remained reserved about certain philosophical implications. Joseph Dalton Hooker, an influential botanist, also maintained a long correspondence with Darwin. Both quickly understood the magnitude of the issue. It was not only about helping Darwin preserve the authorship of his theory, but also about acting equitably towards Wallace. Lyell and Hooker decided to organize a joint presentation of the works of both researchers before the prestigious Linnean Society of London. During the session on July 1st, 1858, the audience discovered, in the absence of the two protagonists, a historic communication. They read out in full the letter from Wallace sent from Ternate, then excerpts from Darwin's essay written in 1844, as well as a letter Darwin had sent to botanist Asa Gray to briefly summarize his ideas on natural selection. This parallel presentation clearly showed how both naturalists had arrived at virtually identical conclusions while taking distinct paths. The gesture by Lyell and Hooker was above all diplomatic. It protected Darwin, who had earlier excerpts demonstrating the long gestation of his thought, and it offered Wallace immediate public recognition of his discovery. The members of the Linnean Society, however, reacted with less fervor than might have been expected. The session was calm, and few press reports mentioned the event in the days that followed. The echo, nevertheless, remained notable within the scholarly community, as this presentation marked the first official step of the theory of natural selection in the scientific world. The mediation orchestrated by Lyell and Hooker remains a unique example of scientific diplomacy, paving the way for the birth of a new paradigm in biology, despite the reluctance of some of the public. The relative anonymity of Wallace, covered in glory in certain circles, contrasted with the more established notoriety of Darwin, already supported by a solid academic network. After the session at the Linnean Society, Darwin, deeply shaken by the recent events and the urgency to clarify his thesis, set to work with renewed determination. Urged by Lyell and Hooker, he abandoned the idea of a voluminous opus that would have detailed every observation and argument. Instead, he began to condense his research into a more succinct text, designed as an abstract of his main ideas. This swift editorial shift aimed to present in an accessible way the essence of natural selection and the multitude of examples illustrating it, ranging from breeding practices to variations in wild populations. At the same time, Wallace, still occupied in the remote Malay archipelago, did not realize the magnitude of what was unfolding in Europe. He only knew that his reflections had found resonance with Darwin and had finally been presented to an official audience. This unexpected acceleration led to the feverish writing of a forthcoming book, shorter than initially planned, but substantial enough to trigger a revolution in the scientific understanding of life. The path was now set toward the publication of a foundational text entirely devoted to evolution by natural selection. In November 1859, Charles Darwin publishes in London a work that will soon transform the view of the natural world, On the Origin of Species, by means of natural selection. The book arrives in a context where passionate scientific debates are already resonating within scholarly circles, while the general public knows little of the subtle details of the nascent biology. It is printed in only 1,250 copies for the first edition, and the stock is depleted in less than 24 hours. The publisher, John Murray, surprised by the speed of the sales, hastens to prepare additional printings, foreseeing the colossal demand to come. Divergence is also an essential concept presented in this book. Darwin proposes the idea that populations descending from a common ancestor can, after many generations, gradually diverge in their characteristics. Over the course of this divergence, new lineages appear, capable of colonizing different environments and exploiting various niches. Concurrently, he cautiously addresses the imperfections of the fossil record, acknowledging that geological archives leave vast gaps between extinct species and current forms. According to him, these gaps are not an argument against evolution, but a reflection of our partial knowledge of the past. Equally important is the section dedicated to the geographic dimension of biodiversity, where Darwin emphasizes the distribution of species across the globe. He observes that related forms live in nearby regions or on islands subjected to similar environmental conditions, suggesting a common ancestry that has diverged locally. Embryology and structural homologies also play a crucial role. Darwin notes that vertebrate embryos possess striking similarities, even if, as adults, their forms turn out to be radically different. For him, these resemblances belong to the legacy of a distant, shared ancestor. Another piece of evidence. Darwin adopts a very measured rhetoric to avoid directly clashing with the religious sensitivities of the time. He thus mentions the possibility that his observations shed light on the origin of man, without directly addressing this subject. This caution shapes his argumentative approach. He accumulates examples, multiplies references to domestic variations, and relies on the analogy between breeders' selection and natural processes. He also preemptively responds to various objections, admitting that some apparent inconsistencies result mainly from gaps in the documentation or the complexity of biological mechanisms, forever in question. In the camp of supporters, Thomas Henry Huxley stands out for his eloquence and determination. Nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog, he engages in an unrelenting argumentative battle to defend natural selection. Asa Gray, an American botanist, proposes a compatibility between theology and evolution, considering that the mechanisms described by Darwin can fit into a broader divine plan. Conversely, the Bishop Samuel Wilberforce openly criticizes the thesis, questioning its foundations and mocking the idea of a common ancestry between humans and apes. Richard Owen, a prominent anatomist, adopts an ambivalent position, sometimes very confusing. Beyond the Anglophone world, the book quickly makes its way internationally. Translators seize the text to distribute it in continental Europe, the United States, and even in distant parts of the British Empire. Reactions vary according to cultural contexts. In France, some naturalists are skeptical and cling to more fixed conceptions. In Germany, Ernst Haeckel finds inspiration to build his own biological laws. In the United States, the debate is rooted in an already lively tension surrounding the relationship between science and religion. The book becomes a pivotal point of numerous academic discussions, cutting through doctrinal positions. In the 1860s, the theory of natural selection begins to establish itself in scholarly circles, but it also provokes strong public emotions. The famous Oxford debate in 1860 is often cited as a turning point. During a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, Thomas Henry Huxley, a staunch defender of Darwin's ideas, and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, an eminent speaker and critic of Darwinism, engage in a verbal duel. Wilberforce reportedly asked Huxley whether he claimed his descent from an ape on his grandfather's side or his grandmother's. Huxley, not easily intimidated, replied that he would rather descend from an ape than from a person who uses his oratory skills to ridicule a serious scientific subject. This punchline, reported and amplified by newspapers, quickly takes on a legendary status. Yet, historians insist, the event does not definitively seal Darwin's victory. It primarily highlights the media impact of the debate, with an audience eager for these controversies opposing science and religion. Meanwhile, the Scottish physicist and mathematician Lord Kelvin presents thermal arguments to contest the view of an Earth that is hundreds of millions of years old. Based on calculations concerning the cooling of our planet, he concludes that the Earth's age would be much shorter, perhaps only a few tens of millions of years at most. This estimate contradicts the extensive time required by the slow process of natural selection. Kelvin, bolstered by his status, thus engages in a controversy over the chronological scale that Darwinism requires. Faced with these propositions, Darwin remains cautious, aware that the question of geological duration is crucial for validating the effectiveness of his evolutionary mechanism. Another major debate revolves around heredity. The theory of natural selection implies that certain variations are transmitted and accumulated, but it is still unknown how traits pass from one generation to the next. The dominant hypotheses suggest a blending that would dilute parental traits. Pressed by this conundrum, Darwin proposes in 1868, in his book Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, a hypothesis called pangenesis. According to this provisional idea, each part of the body would emit tiny particles that migrate to the reproductive cells and thus influence the offspring. Lacking precise experimental means, this theory remains conjectural, but it attempts to fill a pressing gap, the very mechanics of trait transmission. In 1871, Charles Darwin publishes The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, where he explicitly addresses human origins. This publication represents a radical extension of his theory of evolution, as it argues that humans share a common ancestor with the great apes. In a Victorian society still strongly marked by natural theology, the idea of a shared ancestry upsets many minds. Darwin supports his argument with anatomical, embryological, and behavioral comparisons, emphasizing the progressive continuity between the human species and other primates. Skulls, bone structures, and emotions, according to him, show more similarities than differences in kind. From then on, The Descent of Man directly incites a mix of scholarly curiosity, cautious enthusiasm, and vehement opposition. The major novelty of this work lies in its conception of sexual selection, a mechanism complementary to natural selection. Darwin explains that individuals who display characteristics attractive to the opposite sex, or who outcompete their rivals, gain a reproductive advantage. These traits can take the form of bright ornaments, like in certain birds, or courtship behaviors typical of mammals. This idea addresses an apparent puzzle. Why does nature produce traits that are sometimes costly, with no obvious utility for survival? To Darwin, romantic competition shapes evolution as much as the simple struggle for existence. Thus, decorative horns or feathers become reflections of a species dynamic where conquest and seduction prevail, determinant effect. In The Descent of Man, Darwin also argues that man is not exempt from this sexual selection. He contends that some physical differences between men and women, like musculature or body hair, may have emerged under the influence of aesthetic preferences. Male rivalry, displays of strength and bravery, once necessary for hunting or group protection, may also have helped attract females' attention. These considerations clash with the belief that human culture and morality can be entirely explained by spiritual principles. By integrating humans into the evolutionary framework, Darwin challenges the strict boundary between nature and society. To many, it's a major theoretical and ideological upheaval with multiple consequences. The following year, in 1872, Darwin published The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, where he explores the continuity of facial expressions and emotional gestures between humans and other animals. He draws on observations from correspondence worldwide to compare, for example, fear in humans and lip curling in dogs. According to him, these expressions derive from primitive reflexes whose initial function could be defensive or communicative. Over time, they became recognized signals, playing a fundamental role in socialization. This approach lays the groundwork for a psychobio reflection, where the study of biology intertwines with that of psychology. The book generates considerable interest, but also some virulent mockery. For the Victorian public, these ideas sometimes seem scandalous. Equating human emotion with the reflexes of a dog or monkey offends religious sensibilities and anthropocentric pride. In some journals, Darwin is ridiculed, portrayed with a gorilla's head. However, influential scientists like biologist Thomas Henry Huxley fervently defend the Darwinian thesis. Philosophically, these discoveries reignite debates on free will and the soul, with some fearing that humans are merely advanced machines. Others see it as a more embodied vision of human nature, where morality is rooted in common biological mechanisms. Simultaneously, budding anthropologists and psychologists use the work to fuel their own research on emerging behaviors. Beyond scholarly circles, the reach of these publications touches other fields. Physicians and psychiatrists, particularly in France and Great Britain, are interested in the clinical implications of emotional expression. They see it as a means to better understand certain mental disorders, grounding them in more organic rather than purely moral bases. In anthropology, the testimonies collected by Darwin contribute to comparative studies on body language across different societies, paving the way for a more systematic ethnology. Likewise, pioneers of experimental psychology strive to measure, categorize, and analyze these expressions to grasp the innate and acquired aspects of emotional reactions. Each discipline finds a basis to refine its questions and deepen its nascent hypotheses. Many readers, intrigued by this fresh perspective on the human species, perceive in it the foundations of an evolutionary anthropology and a comparative psychology. For some, the idea that facial expressions have an evolutionary history incites a desire to conduct more rigorous research, to empirically verify the universality of these expressions. Photographers attempt to capture the precise moment when surprise or anger arises, hoping to prove invariance. Meanwhile, moralists worry about the apparent reduction of human destiny to biological mechanisms, fearing a devaluation of free will. Regardless of the positions adopted, Darwin's books dedicated to humans, sexuality, and expression succeed in perpetuating the debate between admitted fascination and fierce rejection in all circles. In the decades following the publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859, Charles Darwin devoted himself to a series of experimental works on plants, undertaken mainly between 1862 and 1881. It was an intense period in which he no longer limited himself to the study of variation and selection, but also explored the physiology, floral structure, and the capacity of plants to react to their environment. The first major work of this period, published in 1862, is titled On the Various Contrivances by which British and Foreign Orchids are Fertilized by Insects, often shortened to orchids. In this work, Darwin studies in detail the ways in which different species of orchids have developed elaborate forms to attract and guide insect pollinators, illustrating the idea of complex co-adaptations shaped by natural selection. In this work, Darwin notably makes a bold prediction concerning the star orchid of Africa, Angraecum sesquipedale, endowed with a nectar spur that can exceed 30 centimeters. Based on the principle that every floral adaptation corresponds to a particular pollinator insect, he hypothesizes the existence of a moth possessing a proboscis of equivalent length. This conjecture astonishes some readers, but it will be validated several decades later when naturalists indeed discover a species of sphinx moth with an impressive proboscis conforming to Darwinian prediction. Thus, the monograph on orchids illustrates both the finesse of his observations, the use of meticulous dissections, and the ability to conceive testable hypotheses founded on the logic of natural selection and the symbiosis between plant and insect. After this first milestone dedicated to orchids, Darwin shifts his research towards various phenomena of mobility and adaptation in plants. In 1865, he publishes a short study on climbing plants, which he revises and expands in 1875 in a more comprehensive work. His interest focuses on how certain stems, tendrils, or modified leaves perform movements of circumnutation, that is, slight rotary movements. He examines the speed, amplitude, and direction of these rotations, establishing detailed timings. Likewise, he becomes engrossed in insectivorous plants, notably Drosera, capable of capturing small living organisms using leaves equipped with secretory tentacles. In 1875, he publishes Insectivorous Plants, where he demonstrates that these plants actually digest their prey to absorb nutrients. In his 1876 book, The Effects of Cross and Self-Fertilization in the Vegetable Kingdom, Darwin analyzes the consequences of cross-pollination compared to self-fertilization in different plant species. He sets up genuine experimental protocols where he isolates certain subjects to verify if seed production varies according to the pollen's origin. His results generally show a clear advantage to cross-fertilization, which he attributes to the introduction of broader variability and greater vigor in the offspring. The following year, in 1877, he deepens these observations in the different forms of flowers on plants of the same species, where he describes the existence of distinct floral morphotypes within the same species, reinforcing his thesis on the importance of pollen exchange between different individuals. In 1880, Darwin published The Power of Movement in Plants, a comprehensive treatise written in collaboration with his son, Francis. In this work, they explore the mechanisms by which plants perceive and respond to light, gravitational, or tactile stimuli. The concept of circumnutation, already outlined in studies on climbing plants, is further developed through extremely controlled observational protocols. The authors note, for example, the gradual inclination of grass coleoptiles toward a light source, a phenomenon they relate to phototropism, which is growth oriented towards light. They also explore the notion of diaheliotropism, which describes the orientation of leaves to maximize solar ray reception. These works detail a range of ingenious devices, such as small clinostats, allowing the measurement of microscopic movements. In parallel with these investigations into plant sensitivity, Darwin dedicates himself to another groundbreaking study, this time focusing on the role of earthworms in soil formation and composition. In 1881, he publishes The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms, based on prolonged observations and experiments conducted in his own garden. He seeks to determine how these burrowing animals, by ingesting and excreting soil, contribute to the constant renewal and enrichment of the vegetable layer. To probe their sensitivity to vibrations, he conducts various surprising experiments, such as playing music for them or placing pots on the ground to create mechanical waves. It is not the sound itself, but the tremors that excite their reaction. In 1851, when Charles Darwin's beloved daughter Annie falls gravely ill, the naturalist's vulnerability is painfully revealed. Since her birth, Annie represents a source of joy and curiosity for Darwin, with a lively temperament that sparks his paternal admiration. Unfortunately, her health deteriorates despite the available medical care, which remains rudimentary at that time. Darwin watches helplessly as his daughter agonizes, seeking refuge sometimes in his scientific study, other times in the support of his wife Emma. Emma Darwin, from the Wedgwood family and a devout believer, attempts to offer spiritual comfort in the face of this tragedy, while respecting her husband's silent caution towards dogmas. Annie's death at the age of 10 causes a profound emotional shock in Darwin. He notes in his diary the open wound this event leaves in him, a wound that contributes to his gradual distancing from a comforting theistic view. Although never strictly claiming atheism, Darwin shifts towards a more pronounced agnosticism after this loss. The despair he experiences does not deter him from the affection he feels for Emma, who remains a luminous presence and moral support. This family tragedy, often overshadowed in purely scientific accounts, shapes an intangible part of Darwinian reflection on life and death. This episode also heightens Darwin's empathy for the suffering of the living world, while underscoring the fragility of each existence within a universe governed by natural laws. Installed at Down House since 1842, Darwin continues, after Annie's death, a rigorous work routine. Each morning, he rises early to examine his correspondence from all corners of the globe, as his network extends far beyond the British borders. Scientists, breeders, and even passionate amateurs send him specimens and varied observations. He responds meticulously, noting in multiple notebooks all data that could support or nuance his hypotheses. His desire to confront his ideas with experimental reality does not wane, even when his health proves capricious, marked by chronic ailments since his return from the voyage on the Beagle. Darwin also devotes part of his day to walking along the Sand Walk, a shaded path he had arranged on his property. There he meditates, observes the flora, and reflects on the theoretical scope of his experiments. Mealtimes, taken with family or with passing visitors, provide other opportunities for exchanges where science, religion, politics, and everyday anecdotes intermingle. Emma, very attentive, manages the household and supports her husband's work, despite religious convictions sometimes at odds with Darwinian thought. Down House gradually becomes a discreet intellectual center where botanists, geologists, and sometimes simple, curious minds intersect. The number of letters that Darwin writes or receives numbers in the thousands. Over time, they become a crucial source for measuring the international impact of his theory. Despite his fragile health, Darwin never stops writing, publishing, and sharing his experimental data. However, his body weakens over the years, and episodes of fatigue become more frequent. On April 19, 1882, at the age of 73, he passes away in his home at Down. Those around him report that he maintained an insatiable curiosity to the very end, still questioning plant formations and examining specimens picked from the garden. The news of his death spreads rapidly in the British and international press, triggering scattered tributes that testify to his fame. Several scholarly organizations express their wish to pay him a final homage. While some ecclesiastical circles are reserved, the decision is ultimately made to bury him at Westminster Abbey, a sacred place that usually hosts the most illustrious figures of the nation. The choice of this site, not without provoking some debates, is approved at the highest level and symbolizes the national recognition given to the man who transformed the understanding of nature. His peers from the Royal Society, the Geological Society, and various academic circles join the funeral, thus marking the historical importance of his work. This state gesture, sealing his coffin near the graves of Newton and other great minds, attests to the breadth of the scientific legacy he leaves behind. For Emma and his close ones, this ceremony holds particular significance, blending the intimacy of family mourning with the public dimension of a rare national honor. In the decades following Darwin's passing, his theory of natural selection continues to spark passionate debates. Toward the end of the 19th century, scientists seek new foundations to explain the transmission of hereditary traits, a point that remained unclear in the initial formulation of evolution. In 1900, the works of Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian monk and a pioneer of genetics, were rediscovered more than 3 decades after their first publication went unnoticed. Mendel had demonstrated through experiments on pea plants that the transmission of traits follows precise quantitative laws, providing a more solid framework for understanding variation and heredity. Gradually, biologists begin to see Mendelian logic as a natural extension of Darwin's ideas, insofar as the concept of genes allows them to conceptualize the material basis upon which selection operates. However, it is only during the 1930s and 1940s that the modern synthesis truly emerges, orchestrated by scientists like Ronald Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, Sewall Wright, Theodosius Dobzhansky, Ernst Mayr, and Julian Huxley. They combine Mendelian genetics, statistics, and Darwinian theory to forge a robust theoretical framework. This synthesis largely explains how random genetic mutations subjected to selection could lead over generations to the slowly accumulated transformations in living species. The population and quantitative models developed at this time lay the foundation for a modern evolutionary biology that continues to describe the diversification and adaptation of living beings. After Darwin's death, his ideas are sometimes misrepresented. Social Darwinism, used to justify political inequalities, distorts natural selection by advocating the domination of so-called fittest individuals. Simultaneously, eugenics, which encourages reproductive control policies, sometimes invokes Darwin, although he never legitimized such practices. These deviations provoke fierce ethical criticism and remind us that science describes evolutionary mechanisms without directly dictating political choices. Across the world, Darwin's thought leaves a lasting mark on biology, ecology, and medicine. His discoveries also influence agronomy and, more recently, informatics, via evolutionary algorithms. The sites visited by the Beagle, such as the Galápagos, become global symbols of scientific heritage. His principles are found in the construction of phylogenetic trees, paleogenomics, and the study of developmental constraints, reminding us that natural selection remains a major explanatory foundation.